A cop spits on a Mexican man, then finds out he's the chief of police. It was the kind of dry Arizona heat that clung to your skin and made the air shimmer above the pavement, and Antonio Cruz could feel every degree of it through the windshield of his old charcoal sedan as he navigated the cracked streets of South Phoenix. He wore no uniform that day, just a plain navy polo shirt, jeans, and a pair of sunglasses that couldn't hide the deep lines around his eyes. No badge, no symbols of authority, just a man behind the wheel, driving slowly through a neighborhood that the rest of the city only ever talked about when crime statistics were brought up. Antonio had grown up in places like this, where the heat wasn't the only thing that made your chest feel tight. He knew these blocks, every weather-worn mural, every crooked street sign, every rusted basketball hoop nailed above a garage that hadn't held a car in years. But he hadn't come here for nostalgia. He was observing, listening, remembering what it meant to live under the gaze of power rather than be the one holding it. In 2 days, he'd be announced as the new chief of police for Phoenix, the first Latino ever to hold that title in the city's history, and he wanted to see the city unfiltered before the press conferences and department meetings began. He turned left onto a narrow street, the kind most patrol officers avoided unless they had to answer a call. As he passed a small church with boarded-up windows, he noticed a black and white patrol car in his rearview mirror. No sirens, no lights, just there, lurking. At first, Antonio didn't react. A trailing officer wasn't uncommon. But after 2 turns and a slow pass by a park where 3 kids kicked a deflated soccer ball, the cruiser was still following. He knew what this was. He'd been followed before, even with 20 years on the force, even with 3 commendations for bravery, even with a spotless record. None of that had ever protected him from being seen as just another brown man in a suspicious car. The cruiser lit up behind him, blue and red strobing silently across the sun-bleached street. Antonio sighed and pulled to the curb. He didn't move right away. He kept both hands on the wheel, breathing steady. Through the side mirror, he watched the patrol door open, and out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered officer with pale skin already tinged red by the sun. Sunglasses. A stiff walk. That was Patrick Miller. Antonio recognized him instantly. Miller had a file with more internal complaints than commendations, most of them related to the way he handled stops in neighborhoods like this. He was known for being aggressive, dismissive, and, though no one said it out loud anymore, deeply biased. As Miller approached, hand resting casually but purposefully on the grip of his sidearm, Antonio knew exactly how this was going to go. Still, he said nothing. Just waited. License and registration, Miller demanded. No hello. No reason. Just authority flexed like a reflex. Antonio turned his head calmly. Good afternoon, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped? Miller didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned down and scanned the interior of the car, eyes darting with an assumption already locked in place. Tail lights busted, he said flatly. Antonio didn't respond to the lie. He simply nodded. Understood. Slowly, deliberately, he reached toward the glove box. I'm retrieving my registration now. Miller's hand didn't move off his weapon. Antonio noted the tension in his posture, how ready he seemed for something to go wrong. He retrieved the documents and handed them over with care. Miller looked at the license, scoffed lightly. Cruz, huh? Where you from? Antonio had heard that tone 100 times. That question wasn't curiosity. It was coded suspicion. Phoenix. Born and raised, he said without a trace of anger. I went to South Valley High, about 3 blocks from here. Miller grunted. Right. He turned and walked back to his cruiser without another word. Antonio sat there in silence. The sun beat down through the windshield. He could have told Miller who he was, could have ended the stop in 1 sentence. But he didn't. He wanted to see exactly how far this would go, how deep the rot still ran. After several minutes, Miller returned, less aggressive now, but still carrying that edge of disdain. Says here you work for the department, he muttered. Antonio nodded. That's right, 20 years. Miller frowned. Never seen you. I work administrative now, Antonio said. Downtown division. Miller seemed to shift his weight uncertainly. Your tail light still looks busted. I'll get it checked out, Antonio replied evenly. Thank you for the heads up. Miller paused. His eyes squinted just slightly behind the glasses. You know, Cruz, people like you, driving around here like you own the place, doesn't help anyone. Antonio turned his head fully this time, meeting the officer's gaze through the lens of his glasses. It's 2025, officer. Comments like that violate department policy. Miller flinched, just barely. You threatening me? No, Antonio replied, voice steady. Just reminding you of the standards we're supposed to hold each other to. There was a moment of charged silence. Then Miller stepped back, clearly irritated, and walked away. As the patrol car pulled off and disappeared down the street, Antonio sat for a long second before exhaling. He looked up at the cracked ceiling of his car, then started the engine again. This moment wasn't new. It was the same kind of silent violence he'd seen all his life. And it was exactly why he'd accepted the promotion. Tomorrow, the department would know his name. But today he was just another man on the road, wearing the wrong skin in the wrong part of town. He turned the wheel and drove on. Not away from the confrontation, but deeper into the neighborhoods he had sworn to serve. Because change wouldn't come from speeches or plaques. It had to begin here, where the problem lived, where men like Patrick Miller still pulled people over for looking like him. Antonio Cruz didn't need to punish. He needed to reform. And he would start with the truth, wherever it showed itself. Even in the rearview mirror. The cruiser didn't leave. Even after Officer Patrick Miller had checked his license, scanned the registration, and returned the documents with barely veiled disdain, he lingered like a shadow that refused to lift. Antonio Cruz noticed him in the rearview mirror, following again, 2 car lengths behind, slow and deliberate. Antonio didn't speed up. He didn't swerve. He kept his hands steady on the wheel, his face calm, though something inside him began to smolder. He turned right, taking another loop through the neighborhood, a silent test, and Miller mirrored his turn. That was enough. Antonio pulled to the side of the road beneath the faded shade of a crumbling overpass and put the car in park. He sat for a moment, watching the road ahead, breathing through the tension that had started to coil inside his gut. The cruiser stopped behind him. A long pause. Then the door opened again. Miller stepped out, walking slower this time, hand once again resting on his holster like it was a habit he'd never had to unlearn. Step out of the vehicle, he said flatly, voice hard and joyless. Antonio turned his head, his tone even. Is there a reason for this, officer? There's a discrepancy in your ID, Miller answered without blinking. I need to verify something. Antonio didn't argue. He opened the door and stepped out, standing tall under the blazing sun. He wasn't in uniform, but his presence had its own kind of authority, one that wasn't taught at the academy. Discrepancy? Antonio repeated, his voice low. What kind? Miller shrugged like it didn't matter. Just doesn't match the profile, he said, and the way he said profile made the meaning plain. Antonio studied his face, the subtle shift in expression, the way Miller couldn't quite hide the satisfaction in exercising his power. And what profile would that be exactly, he asked. Miller ignored the question and walked a slow circle around the sedan, glancing inside like he was still hoping to find something. What did you say you did again? He asked, peering over the roof. I didn't say, Antonio replied. But I believe you guessed. Miller smirked and stopped walking. You work downtown, right? What is it, maintenance? Parking enforcement? Janitor. Antonio didn't react outwardly, but the words hit like a slap. They always did, even when you'd heard them before. Still, he kept his posture neutral. I work in the administrative division, he said evenly. Miller stepped in closer. You know, he said, people have been caught forging department IDs before. Especially with the kind of connections you probably have. Antonio's jaw tightened just enough to notice. He reached slowly into his back pocket and pulled out his credentials, flipping them open without a word. Miller glanced at them but didn't take them. That's supposed to impress me, he said. Looks pretty clean for a fake. Antonio held his gaze. You already ran my license. You know it's valid. You know who I am. I know what I see, Miller said, and his voice had that dangerous calm to it. And I see a guy with a last name that doesn't match the role he's pretending to play. Or maybe it's the skin color, Antonio said quietly. Miller stepped back slightly, clearly caught off guard. Watch it. I have been, Antonio replied. Every second since you pulled me over. Miller didn't respond. He took the ID finally, walked back to his cruiser without another word, and sat there for a long time. Antonio stood still, letting the sun burn into his back, feeling the old frustration rise from the center of his chest. He'd been here before. Not this street, not this exact stop, but this feeling, the hollow silence where dignity met insult, and no one was watching but the sky. Minutes passed before Miller returned, face unreadable, voice cold. "Everything checks out," he muttered, handing back the ID. Antonio took it with a quiet nod. "Next time, don't get clever," Miller added. "Just follow directions. Makes things easier." Antonio looked at him. "Easier for you, you mean?" Miller leaned forward. "Watch yourself, Cruz." "I always do," Antonio said. Then he got into his car and drove away. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. The bitterness clung to him like heat, sticky and stubborn. He drove in silence, the streets blurring around him as his thoughts spiraled. This was why he had taken the job. This was why he couldn't say no when the offer came through. Because men like Patrick Miller weren't the exception. They were the rot in the middle, the part that festered quietly behind paperwork and protocol. Miller wasn't just rude. He wasn't just paranoid. He was part of a culture that dressed itself in duty but bled prejudice when no one was watching. Antonio knew that culture. He had fought it every inch of his career, step by step, never giving them an excuse to push him out. But it still found ways to remind him. Even now, even here, even after 2 decades. At a gas station on 18th and Jefferson, he finally pulled over again, killed the engine, rested his hands on the wheel. The quiet settled around him like dust, and in that stillness, he let the weight of what had just happened sit with him. Not rage, not fury, just the slow, steady ache of a wound reopened. He thought of his father, once stopped for the way he asked a question, beaten for the tone in his voice. He thought of his uncle, who lost his job after speaking up in a room full of white uniforms. He thought of the younger officers who came to him in private, terrified to file complaints. He pulled out his phone, opened the department's internal portal, stared at the blank search bar for a long moment. Then he typed, "Miller, Patrick, 7 complaints. 5 marked resolved. None with consequences." He locked the phone, set it aside, and stared out the windshield. This wasn't about Miller anymore. This was about the system that allowed him to operate without fear, to stop a man like Antonio without cause, and still walk away as if nothing happened. In 2 days, Antonio would become chief of police. But the real work had already begun. Quiet, relentless, and necessary. He took a breath, started the engine, and drove back into the city. The morning inside Phoenix Police Headquarters was thick with the kind of silence that doesn't announce itself but creeps in, lingers, and settles like dust over polished tile floors and quiet footsteps. No one said it out loud, but they all felt it. Something was coming. Something big. The department-wide memo had landed in inboxes late the night before. Mandatory 9 a.m. meeting for senior patrol staff. No exceptions, no details. Officer Patrick Miller walked in 5 minutes late, unbothered as usual, a half-wrapped breakfast burrito in one hand, the other lazily adjusting the radio on his belt. His uniform shirt was untucked at the back, and his face held that same loose arrogance he always carried when he knew the rules didn't really apply to him. He walked into the room like he owned it, until his eyes landed on the man standing at the head of the long oak table. It hit him like a slap. There, in full uniform, with medals gleaming on his chest and 4 stars on each collar, stood the same man Miller had pulled over the day before. The same man he'd accused of forging an ID. The same man he'd told to watch himself. Antonio Cruz. But not in street clothes now. Not anonymous. Not silent. He stood in command, surrounded by the upper ranks of the department, his presence quiet but solid, like concrete cured in heat. His expression didn't change when Miller entered. He just watched. Miller froze for a fraction of a second, blinking, as if trying to reconcile the man from yesterday with the one standing before him now. He looked around, hoping someone else had noticed the setup, the trick, the impossible coincidence, but no one gave him anything. Most were too busy absorbing the news they hadn't expected. Cruz began speaking, voice calm, even, but firm enough to cut through the thick quiet. "Good morning. For those I haven't worked with directly, my name is Antonio Cruz. As of this week, I've been appointed chief of police for the city of Phoenix." A slow wave passed over the room. Not shock, but the cold realization that nothing was going to be the same. Cruz let the silence stretch just long enough before continuing. "Before we begin, I want to address an incident that occurred yesterday morning in District 4 involving a civilian traffic stop that has resulted in a formal complaint. That complaint alleges racial profiling, unprofessional conduct, and misuse of authority." Cruz's eyes swept the room once, but didn't settle on anyone. Yet, The individual who filed the complaint is a practicing attorney who was stopped and questioned under questionable circumstances. That stop escalated without cause. Then his gaze landed on Miller, and it stayed there. Officer Patrick Miller, were you on duty yesterday in District 4 between the hours of 9 and 11 a.m.? Miller swallowed, the burrito forgotten in his hand. Yes, sir. Did you conduct a traffic stop near Jackson Street? Yes, sir. Did you ask the driver where he was from? Did you question the authenticity of his identification? Yes. Did you call him by name? Not initially, Miller said, his voice thinner now. Cruz didn't look away. Officer Miller, do you recognize that man now? Miller's eyes flicked away, then back. Yes, sir. I do. Then you understand, Cruz said, that the person you questioned, detained, and disrespected yesterday, without cause, was me. The room was stone still. Cruz didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I didn't identify myself during that stop, he continued, because I wanted to see firsthand how the department interacts with civilians, especially civilians who look like me. Cruz took a slow step forward, and what I saw wasn't just one officer making a poor choice. It was the symptom of something deeper. A culture that assumes before it asks, that suspects before it listens, that dismisses respect when it sees a brown face behind the wheel of a car. Miller stood there, red creeping into his cheeks, his body trying to square itself into form. Sir, I had no idea that I was your superior? Cruz cut in. That I carried a badge? That I had the authority to stand here today? He let the question hang. That's exactly the point. You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with decency. Then, with a single nod, Cruz said, effective immediately, Officer Miller is placed on administrative suspension pending a full investigation by Internal Affairs. He will surrender his badge, firearm, and department credentials at the end of this meeting. You could feel the ripple pass through the room like heat from pavement. Miller's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Cruz gestured to a nearby officer, Sergeant Velasquez, who rose from her seat with practiced professionalism. Please escort Officer Miller to HR, Cruz said. Velasquez nodded. Let's go, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Miller moved slowly, eyes down, the walk of someone who knew the ground had disappeared beneath him. As he passed Cruz, he paused for a moment. I didn't know, he said, low, almost a whisper. No, Cruz replied. You didn't want to. When the doors shut behind them, Cruz turned back to the room, letting the moment sit before he continued. This department doesn't just need new leadership. It needs a new standard. What happened yesterday wasn't a misstep. It was a reflection of who we've become when we stop holding each other accountable. His voice didn't rise. He didn't posture. He just spoke like a man with nothing to prove and everything to protect. This isn't about punishment. It's about prevention. Because the moment we accept behavior like that as normal, we abandon the people we swore to serve. He paused, scanning the room. I'm not here to clean house. I'm here to rebuild one. Brick by brick, policy by policy, conversation by conversation. But I can't do it alone. And I won't pretend I can fix what we won't admit is broken. No one spoke. No one moved. And that silence, this time, meant they were finally listening. The air in the office was still when Antonio Cruz closed the door behind Officer Patrick Miller. No sound but the soft hum of the overhead vent and the muted pulse of traffic outside the thick glass windows. The space wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. Just a single desk, a pair of chairs, a few neatly arranged commendations on the wall, and a framed photo of Antonio's graduating class from the academy 2 decades ago, lined up in their pressed blues before time separated them into the realities of who they'd become. Patrick didn't sit. He stood just inside the door, arms crossed, shoulders stiff, eyes flickering with something that wasn't quite defiance, but nowhere near remorse. Antonio moved behind the desk slowly, deliberately, pulling open a drawer and removing a slim brown folder. He placed it on the desk without theatrics, tapping it once. Your file, he said, voice steady. 7 complaints in the last 3 years. 4 of them racial in nature. 3 for excessive use of force. Patrick didn't move. All of them, Antonio continued, closed with internal resolution. Not a single disciplinary mark. Not even a temporary suspension. He paused. Until yesterday. Patrick shifted, jaw clenching. I followed protocol. Every stop I've made was justified. You know how it is out there. People lie, They get mouthy. They escalate first. Antonio's gaze didn't flinch. I do know how it is out there. I know exactly how it is. That's why I'm sitting in this chair. Because I've lived it from both sides of the badge. He opened the folder and slid a few printed pages toward the edge of the desk. Here's the transcript from your stop with Mr. Ramirez, the attorney. Here's a statement from the store clerk you confronted last November. Remember her? Black woman, 53 years old, accused of loitering outside her own shop. Antonio's voice never rose. And here, he said, tapping another page, is the complaint I never filed. From 21 years ago. My father, Manuel Cruz, stopped on his way home from work, shoved face first against a squad car, because he asked why he was being pulled over. In Spanish. Patrick didn't respond. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture loosened, just slightly, like a fault line threatening to shift beneath a frozen surface. Antonio leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, not to threaten, but to close the space. He came home with bruises down his ribs. A dislocated shoulder. No ticket. No charge. Just a warning. You know what that warning said? Next time, speak English. Silence stretched across the room, not as a tactic, but as truth. Patrick exhaled through his nose, his stance relaxing into something closer to resignation. That wasn't me, he said, quieter now. I wasn't even in the force then. But it could have been, Antonio replied. And yesterday? It was. He sat back in his chair, folding his hands. This isn't about whether or not you hate people who look like me. This is about your reflexes, your assumptions, the way you reach for suspicion like it's the holster on your hip. Patrick's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. You think I'm a racist. I think you were trained by a system that lets bias thrive unchecked, Antonio said. And you never questioned it because it never cost you anything. Until now. The words weren't accusations. They were diagnosis. So what now? Patrick asked, shoulders slumped, as if the floor beneath him was starting to give way. You fire me? Put out a press release? Make an example? Antonio studied him for a long moment. I could, he said, but that wouldn't fix anything. What I want is harder. I want you to see what you've become, and then I want you to do the work to undo it. Patrick scoffed. You think this is something I can just unlearn? Like a bad habit? No, Antonio said. I think it's going to take time. And humility. And discomfort. I think it's going to take you walking into rooms where you're no longer the center. I think it means listening without defense. Admitting without justifying. And being willing to be changed by the process, not just survive it. He stood now, rounding the desk, standing across from Patrick with no furniture between them. I'm not interested in saving your job. I'm interested in seeing if you can become the kind of officer this city actually deserves. If you want that, there's a path. But it won't be easy. And it won't be short. Patrick stared at him, hands at his sides, eyes locked. And if I say no? Then Internal Affairs proceeds with the investigation, Antonio said. And we let the record speak for itself. A beat passed. Then another. Patrick looked away for the first time since entering the room, his gaze settling on the photo of Antonio's academy class. His shoulders dropped. You think I'm a monster, he said. No, Antonio replied. I think you've been wearing armor so long. You forgot there was a man underneath it. Patrick's throat worked hard against a tight swallow. He turned back to Antonio, voice softer. You really believe I can change? I believe people can, Antonio said. But not if they pretend they don't need to. Another silence. This one different. Less tense. More human. Then, quietly, Patrick said, Okay. Antonio nodded once. Then let's begin. He reached out, not to shake hands, but to gesture toward the door. Patrick didn't hesitate. He turned and walked out, leaving behind the armor he'd worn into the room, if only slightly loosened. Antonio stood alone for a moment, listening to the footsteps fade down the hall, and for the first time since taking the chair behind that desk, he let himself believe that the department he'd inherited could, maybe, one day, become the department he imagined. Not because every man would change, but because one did. The door hadn't even clicked shut behind Patrick Miller before Antonio Cruz exhaled, low and measured, the kind of breath you take when you're trying to bleed out frustration without letting it harden into something sharp. He stood for a moment in his office, watching the slow rhythm of late-morning sunlight crawl across the floor, warming the corner where an old, slightly crooked coat rack leaned in silent loyalty. The quiet didn't last. A soft knock came at the door, 3 firm raps, then a pause. Antonio didn't need to look. He already knew. "Come in," he said. The door opened, and Elena Morales stepped inside with that same unshakable calm she carried everywhere. She was sharp, compact, and always moved like every second mattered. Years ago, they'd sat side by side in the academy, a pair of brown kids with last names no one could pronounce properly on the first try, who outpaced expectations by staying silent, focused, and 3 steps ahead. Now she was a captain, one of the few women to break that ceiling, and one of the fewer who hadn't lost herself climbing through it. "You handled that better than I would have," she said, shutting the door behind her. Antonio didn't smile. "Did I? You didn't break the desk in half. That counts for something." She stepped forward and placed a slim black flash drive on his desk. "This came in this morning. Johnson's client, the one Miller confronted. He's been recording every interaction he's had with law enforcement since his last complaint went nowhere. Yesterday, he caught Miller. The whole thing. Audio's clear." Antonio looked at the drive, but didn't reach for it. "Bad." Elena tilted her head. "You've heard worse. But not from someone who still wears a badge. Language. Racial aggressive. Threats. The kind that don't sound like a man having a bad day. The kind that sound like it's not the first time." Antonio finally picked up the drive, turned it between his fingers. "We'll file it with internal affairs," he said. "Make sure it's logged properly. I want the chain of custody airtight." "Already done." Elena sat down across from him, folding her hands over one knee. "You're still giving him a shot?" Antonio nodded slowly. "Yeah. Even after this? Especially after this." Elena didn't speak for a moment. Then she leaned forward slightly, her tone more personal. "You're not worried it'll come back to bite you?" "I'm counting on it," he said. "One way or another." The truth was, Antonio had already waited. The press would eventually find out. The department grapevine was already buzzing. There were going to be those who called it weak, naive, dangerous. But they weren't the ones who had to live with the badge they carried. They didn't walk into neighborhoods like Southside or East Monroe and see fear in the eyes of people who used to believe that uniforms meant help. Trust didn't die in public. It bled out slowly, stop by stop, name by name. And the only way to get it back was to earn it. One decision at a time. "If I fire him now," Antonio said, "he becomes a martyr. He spins it, says it was political, says he was targeted. That's the story that gets picked up. But if I hold him accountable, publicly, transparently, and still give him a path back, then the story is about what he chooses to do next, not what I did to him." Elena nodded, lips pressed thin. "You're playing the long game." "I'm playing for the department we could be," he said, "not the one we inherited." They sat in silence for a while, 2 old friends surrounded by the weight of choices no one else wanted to make. Finally, Elena stood. "You're going to need allies," she said. "The kind that speak louder than the ones whispering in back offices." Antonio nodded. "I know. You have me." He looked up, something softening in his eyes. "Always. Always." She turned to leave, then paused. "By the way, you've got that city council thing this afternoon." "Looking forward to it," he said dryly. She smirked. "Liar." And then she was gone. The door shut behind her, and Antonio leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a beat. The audio drive sat on the desk beside him, a small plastic rectangle that somehow carried the weight of decades. He didn't need to hear it to know what was on it. He'd heard those words before, hurled in alleys, muttered in locker rooms, printed in anonymous letters left in mail slots. This wasn't about language. It was about power, who believed they had the right to wield it, and who never questioned the harm it left behind. When he opened his eyes, he picked up the department memo template from his inbox. He typed slowly, carefully, each word landing like a stone laid into a foundation. "Beginning today, Officer Patrick Miller will be placed under formal review, pending the findings of internal affairs. During this time, he will complete a mandatory reassessment and retraining program focused on ethics, procedural justice, and community engagement. This program is not optional. Its purpose is not to rehabilitate an image, but to challenge an officer to confront the gap between uniform and humanity. Accountability, transparency, and growth are no longer department aspirations. They are minimum expectations." He hit save, but didn't send it yet. Instead, he walked to the window, looking down at the courtyard below, where a group of rookies was being led through de-escalation drills by a field sergeant. Their voices floated up, light and fast. One of the recruits hesitated, raising a mock baton too quickly, and the trainer corrected him with a sharp bark and a reset. Start again. Do it right. Antonio watched them for a moment longer, then returned to his desk and hit send. The words flew into the department system like a current. No going back. He stared at the screen for another second, then picked up the phone and dialed. When the line clicked on, he spoke plainly. Patrick, it's Cruz. You're reporting tomorrow morning at 0700 for reassessment. You'll be shadowed. You'll be evaluated. You'll be uncomfortable, but you'll have a chance to earn your place here again. If that's not something you're interested in, let me know now. There was a long pause. Then Miller's voice, quieter than before. I'll be there. Antonio didn't say goodbye. He hung up, placed the receiver down, and sat for a long while staring at nothing in particular. Outside, the sun shifted, casting his reflection faintly in the window glass. A man caught between what was and what could still be made right. The morning of the ceremony broke clean and bright, the desert sky stretching out like a canvas scrubbed free of doubt, as if the city itself had decided, just for today, to breathe a little easier. Outside City Hall, the plaza was already filling with people. Officers in dress blues, families in pressed clothes holding small flags, community leaders, neighborhood kids craning to see over the crowd. Camera crews angled their lenses toward the makeshift podium set beneath a wide, white awning. The seal of the city of Phoenix glinted on the front in the rising sun. Antonio Cruz stood just behind the curtain, his uniform crisp, his medals in perfect alignment. His shoes shined to the point where the sky could almost see itself in them. But what reflected in his face wasn't pride. It wasn't nerves either. It was something quieter, something older. The weight of memory and purpose, tangled together in a man who knew what it had cost to stand here. Behind him, his daughter straightened his collar with gentle fingers. She was 16 now, taller than he expected, her hair tied back just like her mother used to do when they were still figuring out how to be parents and cops and human beings all at once. His wife, Elena, not the captain, but the other Elena, the one who held him up when no one else was watching, stood nearby, eyes glossy, hands folded in front of her like she was holding something sacred. His mother was there too, clutching a worn rosary that had been through more trials than Antonio could count. And when the announcer's voice rang out across the plaza, calling for the city's new chief of police to take the stage, the crowd quieted, not out of politeness, but expectation. Antonio stepped forward into the light, his steps measured, his shoulders straight, the wind brushing faintly against the corner of the American flag beside him. The applause came like thunder, but he didn't raise a hand to silence it. He let it run its course, not because he needed it, but because he understood that the people needed to give it. When it faded, he looked out, not at the cameras, not at the officials in the front row, but at the people behind the barriers. The ones who didn't always get a seat at tables like this. He adjusted the microphone and spoke. I stand before you today not just as your new chief of police, but as a son of this city. A boy who grew up on cracked sidewalks. A young man who watched his father get handcuffed for asking a question. A man who wore a badge for 20 years and still got pulled over without reason. There was no flourish in his voice, no rhetoric, just truth. Law enforcement is not simply about enforcing the law. It is about defending dignity. It is about protecting people not because we have to, but because they deserve it. And if our badge loses sight of that, then it is just metal and weight, not honor. He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Reform is not a word. It's not a headline. It's not a campaign. It's a promise. One we keep when it's hard. One we uphold when it's not convenient. One we enforce not from behind tinted glass or shields, but face to face, heart to heart. He didn't preach. He didn't pose. He told them the plan. Community accountability boards. Body camera audits led by civilians. Mental health training integrated into all academy-level coursework. Transparent disciplinary actions posted quarterly. He told them about second chances, but also about last chances. He told them change would be slow, and it would be painful, and it would piss people off. But it would happen. And then, as the final notes of the speech settled like dust in the light, the people rose again. Not for the uniform, for the man inside it. From the edge of the plaza, one figure didn't clap. Dressed in a simple collared shirt and slacks, Patrick Miller stood still, half in shadow, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed not on Antonio but on the space between them. When the crowd began to disperse and officers returned to their duties, Miller didn't follow. He waited, watched, and finally, when the line of handshakes had thinned and the mayor had disappeared into a black SUV, he stepped forward. He didn't ask permission. He didn't lower his gaze. He just walked up to Antonio, cleared his throat, and said, "I heard what you said. I've been thinking a lot about everything." Antonio said nothing, just watched. Miller looked down, then up again. "I'm not good at this part. The owning up part. I've been taught to hide it, to power through it, to act like it doesn't matter." He shifted his weight. "But it matters. I know that now. What I said, what I thought, what I've let slide. It matters. And I don't expect you to forgive me. Honestly, I don't know if I'd forgive me." Antonio tilted his head slightly. "Then what are you looking for?" Miller took a breath. "A chance. Not a clean slate. Just a crack in the wall. Somewhere I can start over. Prove that I'm not the same man I was." Antonio didn't nod. Didn't answer right away. He looked at Miller the way you look at someone you once knew and aren't sure you want to know again. Then he said, "Actions, not apologies. I understand. You're going to be watched. I expect that. And if you slip, I'm gone," Miller said before he could finish. Antonio nodded once. Nothing more. They didn't shake hands. They didn't hug. They just stood there, for a long beat, two men on opposite sides of a line they'd both helped draw, until one of them decided to step across it. Later that week, they sat in Antonio's office. No uniforms. No formalities. Just two chairs, a desk, a cup of coffee cooling slowly between them. Patrick spoke less. Listened more. Antonio didn't soften, but he did offer something he rarely gave: time. Not because it was owed, because it was needed. The city outside kept moving. Sirens echoed. Radios clicked. People got hurt. Others were saved. But in that room, the quiet was different. It wasn't tense. It was possible. And that was enough. Because transformation doesn't happen in parades. It happens in quiet rooms, behind closed doors, when a man who once got it wrong chooses to sit down and do it right. And maybe, just maybe, that was how the system would change, not with punishment, but with the radical, painful, necessary work of redemption. And so, what began as a quiet confrontation on a forgotten street ended with two men facing not just each other, but their own truths. Because real justice isn't just about laws and titles. It's about the courage to unlearn, to listen, to change. And in that quiet office, with no applause and no spotlight, a new chapter began, not built on punishment, but on possibility. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, or reminded you that change is always possible, no matter how broken things seem, then don't let the message end here. Subscribe to Cracks of Light for more true, powerful stories about dignity, redemption, and the unseen moments that shape who we become. Drop a comment to share your thoughts. Like if the story resonated with you. And hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that could change how you see the world, because sometimes, all it takes is a crack of light.